Hi everyone, and welcome to our bonus show about the Clash of the Cousins podcast and how we reimagined history to build the world of Hood. My name is Korte, and I'm the creator and showrunner of the whole project. And I'm here with Stephen.
Yes, I'm Stephen Goss. I'm the head writer for the podcast, and in that capacity, I was responsible for much of the storylining and the history wrangling.
Yes, Stephen and I have spent many hours looking at real history, choosing what we can use and throwing out what we thought was ridiculous. But there's a lot of ridiculous history that still made it into the show. So today we're going to talk about Empress Matilda, or as we like to call her, Maud. Because in real life there were a lot of Matildas.
And on top of that, it's so much easier for an actor just to say Maud, and it's fewer syllables.
And there's that.
So, Maud's story, that comes out of a real period of history called the Anarchy. And that started in either 1120 or 1135, depending on what you think kicked it off. I mean, you've got the White Ship disaster in 1120, but historians will generally date the beginning of the Anarchy to 1135, because that's the year in which Maud had her claim to the English throne usurped by her cousin, Stephen of Blois.
Yes, but for this podcast, we chose to start with the White Ship disaster, which is when the heir to the English throne, Maud's brother, William Adelin, drowned.
He was actually, it was nobility that led to his death. He not nobility in the sense of noble blood, but in the sense of a moral quality. The ship went down, and instead of rowing away in the rowing boat to safety, he stayed behind to help people, and so drowned. But one person who did get off the ship, and before it even left port, was Stephen of Blois. And there are various theories as to why. It was either because they drank a lot. That's one of the reasons they think the ship sank, because there was a lot of drinking the night before. Or there's a theory that Stephen may have had diarrhea and just simply been unwell and got off. Either way, he dodged that. He probably, we can't know, but he certainly saved his skin, whereas William Adelin, the heir, did not.
So this is what kicked it all off. England lost their heir, and at home, King Henry I now had an issue. He only had a daughter left, which, as we were still in the 12th century, people were not so keen on having a woman on the throne.
It is true that Henry was willing, though. Henry did name Maud as his heir after much deliberation. So she was, in real history, the rightful heir.
That is true. He was quite progressive and wanted his daughter to take over. But even though all of the lords said that we support her, they what's the name again?
They swore fealty to her.
They swore fealty to her. They ignored it, came back on their word, and supported Stephen, which led to him being crowned also with the help of the church. And that's sort of what we also then took from real history, and because in our story we kind of put the high Catholic religion against the church, and this was one of those real life events that we could really use for that there was this hatred between the church and the high Catholic religion, the Temple of High Cath as it's known.
Yes, in general, this episode was a case of looking to real history to guide us through Maud's life and her ancestry as well. It is almost true to say that if you look at the path that took Maud from birth to this point in her life, it sort of almost falls into a 3-act structure of her ancestry, her history, and her revenge pact. So it was a case of history sometimes playing right into our hands, as with the White Ship disaster and the succession crisis that it brought on. But there were also plenty of times where we had to take the religion we'd invented, High Cathism, and the High Catholic magic, and, like Anna said, slot it into history. Turn some people into High Cathi who were actually Catholics, like Margaret, for example, Maud's grandmother.
Yeah, because there was a lot of that going on, especially at these high ranks that Maud belonged to. There was a lot of fealty to the Catholic Church, also by people that we turned into High Cathai. Yeah, which jarred a bit. So we just ignored history and made it our own.
Well, it helps with Margaret and Christina. It helps that by making Margaret a pious High Catha, Christina would become the Catholic, even though she would still have Bethla powers. It made a nice conflict that, you know, we could say, okay, so Margaret got the better High Catholic powers, the Syntha powers from her mother. Set up that set up the, although the Edith, the anecdote of Edith taking a veil off, stamping on it, because of course in real history that was Margaret. Margaret in her Catholicism wanted them to get proper religious education. Of course, we had to change that a bit to say that Margaret wanted them to know what they were up against. But even so, all of the story about Edith being, you know, Edith conflicting with Christina and the veil, taking it off. This was all her testimony her later testimony to the Archbishop of Canterbury to prove that she had never taken holy vows, so that she could marry King Henry I, and thus become Maud's mother. But you know, the story of her claiming to have taken off the veil and stamped on it was too good not to use. So we refashioned that to work with Edith being her mother's daughter, the pious High Catha, in conflict, teenage rebellion against her aunt, Christina. And that worked. That produced a nice scene.
And it's also not just that about religion for the church, for instance, High Cathism, but it's also because we make these people High Cathai, we created a problem for ourselves because we deemed that High Cathai could only be women and only bear daughters as long as they were in power, which meant that a lot of the male heirs could not be biological, or they just couldn't exist. So what we did, for instance, they were important, and so what we did do, for instance, with Maud and her offspring, which were all boys, we made them all girls, because from there on we created a new history and that could work. But this whole set of the Anarchy happens because Maud's brother died, which in real life was a full blood brother, but because in our story that cannot be the case because a High Catha cannot have an older brother, it's just not possible. So we made them a half brother, and we created this idea that High Cathai are very powerful and have worked their way into powerful families, but we still live in an age where people want to have male offspring because that's still the way it was. So they had illegitimate children being, what's the right English?
Passed off
as real full blood. So in reality, Willem of Adeline was Maud's full blood brother, but in our story he's a half brother who is actually not the biological child of Maud's mother, because it's just not possible.
Yeah, well, it goes back at least one generation, because Margaret, Maud's grandmother, Edith's mother, her sons, 3 of her sons were kings of Scotland, one of whom is of course King David of Scotland, Maud's uncle, who comes into the story on the side, but he's important to what happened with the Lincoln Castle and the Chester family and Lucy and Ranulph and all of that will come in episode 5. So we couldn't erase him or his other 2 brothers, kings of Scotland, from history as much as William Adelin. So the fact that, you know, Maud's mother, grandmother and great-grandmother, they were all closely woven into the English royal family by marriage, or the Scottish, as it may be, but you know, they were all the wives of some sort of king or son of king or father of king. So in order to get ourselves out of that hole, we came up with the illegitimate son thing, which we then basically established as the blueprint for any such thing. Of course, that comes back in Lucy's episode 2.
And another thing that we did work into the story is that this was also a potential succession crisis. If it were to become known in this day and age of our story, High Cathai are relatively living under the radar. They don't shout off the rooftops that they are a woman with power. They keep it under wraps. And if it were to become known, there was enough knowledge about High Cathais that they knew that they couldn't have sons, only daughters. So what we addressed it in one of the dialogue scenes with Maud's first husband, the Roman emperor.
Holy Roman Emperor.
Although it's not a church one. It's very confusing. It's not a church one.
But it's important to stress that he was the Holy Roman Emperor, not the Emperor of Rome. They were based in Germany at the time.
It's technically what is Germany now, but he was aware of the fact that Maud was a High Cathar, and he also knew that that was a threat to the English succession, because at that time her brother was still alive. But if that were to become known, then her brother would become illegitimate, because in those days as well, illegitimate children from the king did not have any right to succession if they were not also the child of the queen, which is in a way also weird because it's still their child, still her blood. But that's to the side. So he knew about the fact that she was a High Cathar, and we actually took that opportunity to translate a Dutch expression into English, which did not exist, which is Stephen, help me out here. What's the English version?
Is it two religions in one bed and the devil reared its ugly head?
Exactly.
Of course, that became the first half of that became the title of the episode because it was too good not to.
Yeah, this is really based on an actual existing expression that we quite often used in Holland. So I got a bit of my heritage into this, although everything is English, that bit is Dutch.
Well, I mean, this is a mix of European influences, like you say, this was what is now Germany, and we did, it wasn't just the conflict with Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor. There was also we were also able to use this element of the knowledge of High Cathai to create more conflict there, for one, because it's true that Archbishop Adalbert was a real person and that Henry V did have conflict with him, but we were able to make that darker. It's true that Adalbert later blackmailed Maud into handing over the electoral insignia after Henry died, but we were able to make that, we were able to turn that into blackmail based on Adalbert working this whole thing out about the Heicathism. And not only that, there is later in the episode, there is the letter that Maud writes when she is supposedly dying in childbirth. Now, in real history, she really was... it was a difficult birth, whichever way you look at it, and in real history, she really was thinking she was going to die. So she was writing to say, I want to be buried at this abbey and not that. But we realised, of course, that High Cathar could heal herself from that, and so it would be nonsense for her to be talking about burial. The only way that could be is that, similarly to the Holy Roman Empire, that in England they had to keep a close secret about this, and that Henry and Maud knew between them that she was a High Cathar and had cooked up this ruse of her writing him a letter saying, I'm dying and I want to be buried here, not there.
Yeah, because although at this stage, I believe her brother has already perished in the White Ship disaster, so it's no longer now a case of keeping the bloodlines pure and keeping that bit of the succession standing. This was more a case of we are still living in 12th century England, and although this is a world where High Cathar, which are technically witches, have been around for a while, they have not been in everybody's faces doing millions of stuff, and they are living relatively secluded, and it's still human nature to be a bit afraid of things that you don't understand. So until she was fully in power, Maud was not very interested in revealing the fact that she was a High Cathar, and that's why we took this letter and twisted it so we could still use it, because it's a brilliant letter, although rewritten for it's not the actual letter that you hear in our podcast. but very brilliantly rewritten by Stephen here.
Thank you. I don't think I even tracked down the actual letter. I just made up my version of it to fit. And to be honest, it was written before we nailed down this thing about High Cathai only producing daughters and having to be kept secret. A lot of this episode, and to be honest, the second episode as well, evolved a lot because it was drafted and written in the infancy of this podcast, when we were still working out a lot of the tentpoles of High Catholic magic and the social history of High Cathism pre First High Cath War, and there were a lot of it around it, or how we could find a new direction to go in with the story that would not, that would make sense. And this was one of them.
Absolutely.
This letter.
You often realise that as a writer, it's very easy to write yourself in a corner, and you have to be creative to get yourself out of it. But that's the fun of it. To be fair, I think out of most of the episodes, this is the one that relatively stuck to real history, because this is the introduction of Maud, and the big changes sort of like happen once she takes up that cause of like getting Stephen off the throne. And the rest of this podcast was just about her life, which has happened the way that we portrayed it. That's sort of what we try to do here with this first episode. So we try to lay down the foundations of how it technically was, and we now written it to a point that we sort of said, okay, and up until here we're gonna still keep some stuff, but we're really gonna rewrite it now. And you'll see that once we're gonna go and discuss the subsequent episodes, there will be a lot more changes that have been made. But hopefully this was interesting to you to listen to see what kind of real history we pulled and used, and what we were like, no, that's not going to work, we're going to change that. But
and also just how much you have to watch yourself for historical detail when you're weaving it into a structure like this. More of that in episode 2.
That as well.
That was definitely a challenge. Yeah.
But we hope that you enjoyed this, and we hope to see you again next week.